Our scripture this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 9, starting with verse 35 through chapter 10, verse 8. Then Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the good news of the kingdom, and curing every disease and every sickness. When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore ask the Lord of the harvest to send laborers into his harvest." Then Jesus summoned his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to cure every disease and every sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, also known as Peter, and his brother Andrew, James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the Canaanian, and Judas Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out with the following instructions: "Go nowhere among the Gentiles and enter no town of the Samaritans, but rather go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. As you go, proclaim the good news. The kingdom of heaven has come near. Cure the sick, raise the dead, cleanse the lepers, cast out demons. You received without payment, give without payment." Please pray with me. God of Abraham and Sarah, you found welcome at the tent of Abraham when you visited him at Mamre. You received hospitality and nurture as you traveled, and you blessed Abraham and Sarah with their son Isaac, and they found laughter together. When we call on you and know that you are with us, may we hold up our gratitude as a gift, a sacrifice of tears and laughter and joy. When we have all that we need and more, may our blessing be shared with others. We know that especially when we have been at our weakest, our worst, our most sinful, we have received the generous grace that Christ has made possible. And like the first disciples, we have the responsibility to carry Jesus' message and ministry wherever we go, to whomever we speak, in the ways that we live and take action every day. As disciples of Jesus, our hearts belong to you, God. May the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. In the gospel text I just read, we hear about Jesus traveling around the villages of Palestine, a Roman region of the world that corresponds roughly with the nation of Israel in the First Testament. Some places in this region were populated with the majority of Jewish people who worshiped at the temple, followed the law, and others by those called Gentiles by the Jews. This is an important thing to know because Jesus in this text told the disciples to go, in his words, to the lost sheep of the house of Israel and not to the Gentiles who might live where they were going, and not to the Samaritans, another group that were perceived by the Jewish people to be outside of God's promise. Now, the Samaritans we hear about in the Bible, more than just this spot, the Samaritans are people that have a few stories in the Bible. In the Gospel of Luke, Jesus tells a parable about a good Samaritan. And part of the reason the parable is so powerful is that the Samaritans were not one that his listeners would expect to be the hero of a story, or lifted up as the one who would be righteous or good to others. They were seen as outsiders, yet they also were descendants of Jacob, also known as Israel. We also know a story about a woman at a well in Samaria, where Jesus sits and talks to her. A story about Jesus speaking to an outsider. So, why do you suppose here in the Gospel of Matthew does Jesus tell the 12 disciples to avoid the Gentiles and the Samaritans to focus on the lost sheep of Israel? Now, reading, I found that Jesus' phrase, the lost sheep of Israel, might mean all of the people of Israel. But in the context of this story, and even in the entire book of Matthew, we kind of begin to understand that Jesus is probably talking about the common folks of Israel, the common people of the land, not necessarily including the religious and political leaders, because Jesus also says that they're sheep without a shepherd. The common people then and now were the ones in greatest need of the mission Jesus sent the disciples out to do. Matthew's gospel tends to stay focused on Israel, tends to use stories out of Israel to tell the stories of Jesus, or patterns Jesus, the way the stories are told and the order they're told, after Moses. So again, Matthew's gospel does tend to stay focused on Israel through most of the gospel until after the resurrection, when Jesus sends the disciples into all nations to baptize them. During Jesus' lifetime, though, the message he carried and sent out was focused on Israel, on the people descended from David. Again, I can't really say exactly why, other than they were the ones who already had God's covenantal promises. And Jesus was there to remind them that God had always had care for those who were sheep without a shepherd, reminding them that God had always given the prophets messages that focused on care for one another, caring for those in need, on the poor, and on those who had lost hope, or health, or happiness, or freedom. In this text, we read Jesus' purpose, his mission, expressed in the few verses at the beginning. Jesus was preaching and teaching the good news of the kingdom and curing people who were sick in various ways. And it said he had compassion for them. So in his compassion and his love for them, it seems that he knew that he wasn't enough to do it by himself. He didn't have enough hands and feet to go into all the places where he was needed. So he called the disciples to share in his mission. He calls it the harvest, because there were so many harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. So Jesus sent his disciples out to spread the compassion that he felt, and I'm assuming he hoped that they had it as well, for those lost sheep of Israel. And he sent them out with this sermon: the kingdom of heaven has come near. And to demonstrate that truth, what does it look like? They were to create that kingdom as much as they could in those towns where they were welcomed, by healing the sick, raising the dead, which is something that prophets did, cleansing the lepers, and casting out demons, just as he had done. And they were to do it without being paid for it. As an aside, the text does go on to say they weren't supposed to take provisions for the journey either, but were to receive like room and board. That's how they knew they were welcome to be in a town. They needed to be provided and uplifted by community and the collective relationships that upheld everyone, if you read just a little bit further in this text. Jesus moved in and among the people, and he was moved by the need around him. As his disciples followed him then, and as his disciples now, we are called too to see the need in the world, its hungers and confusions, and called to be moved with compassion as he was, and to respond with care as he was. Now, this church has a history of caring for its neighbors and for its community, as individuals and as a group, as a whole. I know that you have been and are involved in the community's efforts to care for those who are most vulnerable. And this church does remain faithful to Jesus' mission in the ways that it is still possible for us to care, to offer care and service. And that kind of life lived together as a congregation has to continue for a church to be faithful followers of Jesus. And I would say that for the church to continue to be faithful followers of Jesus, we have to look for ways that makes our actions taken for those in need even more effective. We have to grow in that in some way. Maybe not bigger, but different, developing. Everything that we do for the sake of Jesus' lives, people's needs, when done in good faith, fulfills the ways that Jesus calls us to be disciples in this scripture. We might not be casting out demons, but in our service at the food pantry and donations to various missions, we are helping people stay alive and healthy. We're helping people be able to use their resources to do other things that they need in their lives. If they have support for food, they can find ways to help themselves in other ways. Our helpfulness can even be more widespread and made concrete in places we might not think of. As a nation and a state, the taxes we pay help people to get health care when they are too poor to get it themselves. When I was unemployed up until the end of 2018, if it wasn't for Medicaid, Carl and I would not have been able to go to a doctor. If we hadn't had a SNAP card, we wouldn't have had enough to eat, and keep the heat and lights on. We also received help from our families, or we wouldn't have had a home to live in. Even though everyone who pays taxes isn't a Christian or even religious, the ways in which our governmental bodies can help us support one another can help us follow our mission to care for one another. That individual groups and individual people can't. It helps join us together beyond ourselves. We might not like to think of it that way, or we just might not have considered it before. But these systems of support are necessary and vital and often can't be provided in any other way, except that all of us come together as a nation or a state, even as towns, and provide them. So I would propose that one of the ways we are faithful as Christians is to not only pay our taxes, but to get involved in the ways that they are spent. People need to get to and from work, school, home, hospitals, farms, other places that are vital, so roads are vital. And even more specific to the gospel story we read today, in church, in our stories, we learn what is essential to life. We know that caring for the lonely, for those who are treated as if their lives have no value, for those who are oppressed by poverty or race or religion, we have to address those things as people in the church. And we can do that as members, as individuals. And we can do it because of the things that we learn here. We certainly aren't the only ones as Christians who know to love our neighbors, but we know it because Jesus taught us to love our neighbors in passages like today's text. Stories like today's story say that Jesus was so moved by the people's need that he sent out at least 12 more sets of hands and feet and hearts to carry the work of his healing, life-giving ministry. The work they did was a physical demonstration of the words, "The kingdom of heaven has come near." The kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is at least, in its seed point, people who can expect healing and then share it with others in their touch, in their actions. The kingdom of heaven is sharing in our resources so that those who can heal, doctors, nurses, EMTs, and others, will be able to carry on their work and make even more people better, more people well. The kingdom of heaven means that our lives are stamped with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Love God and love your neighbor as yourself. One isn't possible without the other. The gospel says that we see needs and find ways to meet them. The gospel says that we build relationships with people who know their needs very clearly and listen to them, working together for solutions. The gospel says that we tell our leaders when we think they should change their ways because they are wrong, and when they are wrong in the ways that they are not serving the people they lead. The gospel says that we help them come up with ways to do their jobs better. When people are being killed or injured by governmental policies, we need to do all that we can to listen to those whose lives are directly affected by those policies. Then make room for them to tell leaders how to fix those things, and make space for people who are injured to speak. We also participate in healing on a smaller scale by supporting those who are caring for their sick loved ones. On a larger scale, we might advocate for support for people who have to stay home to care for their ill family members. Both of those things are necessary. We might provide respite care for people who are caring for loved ones. We also might support community efforts to do the same when people need more skilled care than friends or family can provide. All of us have gifts, something to give, something to share. Even Judas is sent out in today's gospel to do ministry. All of them were given the authority to do the work of healing and carrying the message of God's kingdom that Jesus had. They weren't sent to do something easy, but they were sent to do the things that Jesus had prepared them to do. And it wasn't easy for other reasons either. The text continues, the next sentence almost after the one I stopped at is, "I am sending you out like sheep among the wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves." And it continues warning them that their message and actions won't be well received, even by their family members. But it wouldn't mean that the message wasn't real and true. We aren't always welcome to speak our minds when we carry the message that God has compassion for all those in need. But just because that welcome isn't there doesn't mean it's wrong. Our job is to continue to share the message of God's kingdom, the kingdom of heaven, as it's called in Matthew's gospel. To share that message of God's kingdom and what it means. If that means the sick are to be cured, the dead raised, the unclean made part of community again, and the demons or evil cast out. It can mean that we know that caring for one another when our care is welcome is how we can be faithful. And we know it's true because it's here. We've always known that taking care of one another is where the gospel lies. I think that sometimes the challenge we face today is we don't feel like our actions always make a difference. Because whatever it is that we do, when we love one another makes a difference. What we do might even require giving up something, even if it's just a way of thinking about what it means to be faithful, but it's still our calling to do that. We can be thankful that we have this purpose, this discipleship in our lives. We can know that we pursue discipleship in our entire lives as individuals, certainly, as a church community, yes, and in each of the ways that we connect to one another, here and throughout the world. In families, through friendships and social connections, and simply as human beings. Our discipleship might feel very small, but it will be a part of all that Jesus' love is doing and has always done. To the glory of God, in covenant, in care, and in comfort. Amen. Each Sunday, I do offer an invitation to find ways to be disciples of Jesus in the faithful ways that Jesus offers. And so I invite you this day to find ways to be faithful to Jesus by caring for one another. At this time, we'll hear in this very room a musical prayer. I invite you to consider that as we hear it.